This week in Pure Reinvention.
The one thing we've done here that maybe is a lesson is we've aligned our mission with something larger than what our members have. It's not just the bottom line at City Hall, or it's not just how does this affect the local inspector's ability to perform his or her job. It's how do we make Michigan better?
Episode 138, Dan Gilmartin, Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, Michigan Municipal League.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this episode of Pure Reinvention, where we create space for the unexpected by inspiring a reinvention lifestyle. Bonifer, every once in a while, we get one of those experiences that just is amazing.
I agree. This interview with Dan was inspiring and motivating. I think people are really going to enjoy it.
Bonifer, what are a couple of the real quick keys that people should be listening for?
I think there were two things for me that really bubbled to the surface. The first was this idea that you got to do the old stuff well before you can move on to new stuff. I think that's a really important reminder. I think the other thing that really struck a chord with me was this idea that their mission, and I'm not saying the actual words of their mission, but he gives this concept that they're moving a little beyond their members, in that Michigan Municipal League is looking at how do they make Michigan better. And I just thought that that big a vision allowed him the space to think creatively and think innovatively and take the organization in a direction it might not have gone otherwise.
The opportunity to spend time and listen to a voice that has a vision greater than just the organization.
Right.
Is phenomenal.
Right.
And you'll be able to pick that up throughout the entire conversation with Dan, that his mind is operating in a leadership space that is very inspiring. And there are so many takeaways. This is a special one, folks.
It's worth the time.
Let's listen.
This week's episode is sponsored by Willpower Consulting. Whether it be pursuing new avenues in content delivery like podcasts, or developing a sustainable content building strategy, Willpower Consulting is with you every step of the way. Get a dose of willpower at WilliamRCarlson.com or at WilliamRCarlson on Twitter.
Dan, thank you for joining our Pure Reinvention podcast.
Glad to be back.
You are now moving into, I guess, for lack of a better word, kind of version 2.0 of the Michigan Municipal League.
Right, kind of a stage 2, if you will.
Yeah, so what's going on?
I've been CEO now for 11 years, and a lot of the work that we had been doing focused around great communities, and we represent cities and villages across the state of Michigan, and have been very focused on sort of getting into downtown issues and housing issues and trying to make communities great places to live. We think that's the future of Michigan. If we can have great places to live, everything else sort of takes care of itself, economy and whatnot. So that's been our focus. A lot of it's been around improving place, and placemaking is something we're known for. Done a lot of work around the state. And we just published a report called A Decade of Placemaking in Michigan, which chronicled what we did for the last 10 years. And it was important in a couple of different ways. One, to show people what's happened and the strides we've made, but also to sort of make it a demarcation line towards, okay, now it's time to move forward. And that really is part of our second stage. What does it take now, having accomplished a lot of goals and a lot of the vision that we set out early on? What do we do now to move to the next 10 years?
So where is this report available? Where
it's available at mml.org. Okay. Again, it's called A Decade of Placemaking in Michigan. It was authored by my wonderful colleague, Shannon Draheim.
Okay, so that's available to kind of documents where you've been.
Yep, accomplishments, wins, successes, a few failures along the way, and really talking about what the organization has done, what our membership has done, and what we've tried to do on behalf really of everybody who lives in Michigan.
So at some point, you as the Chief Executive Officer must have kind of started thinking to yourself, what's going to be the role of MML next?
The right time to think about that is before you're kind of done.
Right. No, right, exactly. Right.
When you're done and you're not sure what you should be doing, it's probably more of a panic time. And I think the organization still runs well and we're still doing some good things. But we've come up against the fact that in order to achieve some of our goals on a higher level, a 2.0 or even a 5 or a 10.0 in terms of how we look at things, we've got to broaden our capacity to engage people. We've got to get outside of our general our general members, local officials, people involved in the community, and get more involved with the business community in particular, and get more involved with people who are trying to rebuild and build their places where they live. And so that's a focus for us, whether we are educating people, whether we are looking at public policy, and ultimately when we're trying to influence what happens in the state from a policy perspective. So all that kind of rolls together to recalibrate what we're going to be doing moving forward.
Dan, how did you know when it was time to start kind of thinking less about version 1, which is important, but really start to shift your mind to pioneering thought on version 2.0?
Every organization, you hear about first and second stage businesses, there's similar things that associations go through as well. I think when you get to the point in the last few years where a lot of what we had laid out early, we've accomplished in terms of some of the tactics and some of the things that we said, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we've done them, and we've seen real gain from them. But the fruit is getting a little less ripe, if you will, and it's time.
It's got a certain shelf life, right?
Absolutely. It's time to find a new tree. It's not a complete new tree what we're looking at. It's just sort of graduating from where we are. We're very proud of what we've done for the last decade. And really 2.0 is building on that. It's not ignoring that. So we said, okay, if we're kind of stuck where we're at right now in terms of being able to make some of the ultimate changes in state policy that we want to look at and in local policy as well, what do we need to do to get there? And that sort of opens up a whole new line of thinking and requires a whole different thought process and, quite frankly, some different staffing and some different goals and different expectations of our board and all those types of things. So that's been the exercise for the last year or so, and it's informing what we're going to be doing moving forward.
So for the last few years, as you became more aware that version 2.0 was very important, how does the executive start to get people shifted in their thought, both at the operational level and at the strategic board level, to recognize it was time to embrace version 2.0?
I think you start by embracing it yourself. It's a time to show leadership in terms of, okay, let's do something a little bit different here. Then I think in terms of an internal perspective, you've got to give people internally the opportunity to think differently. Getting them out to see different things, introducing them to what other organizations might be doing, either just like your organization, like a peer organization, or in our case, a lot of times it's people that aren't even in our business, if you will. And I think you've got to leave time for people to reflect a little bit. And I think one of the things that we found ourselves doing was we went from being a catalyst for a number of years on these issues to actually being a provider of some of the services and things. And that's not really our
So you were
niche.
beginning to take on new business ventures, new activities that forced people to kind of open their eyes and see things differently.
It did. And I think we learned a little bit about who we are. Studying innovation, I know it's all but what you guys do. It's sort of you innovate, then you standardize, and then you optimize. And that's not necessarily who we are in terms of optimizing a product or something. Our products, we're not big enough to be in every community in the state. That shouldn't be our goal. We're best when we innovate. So we sort of had to figure out how do we sort of wind down what we're doing in terms of the work that we're actually doing in the field and reinvent it on a larger scale to, again, not ignore what we were doing, but to build off of that in a way that we know what we're good at. That's what we're best at. We're best at pushing that envelope. We're best at trying new things and doing new things. And you've got to sort of, from a staff perspective, take people out of what they're doing and allow them to think differently about what tomorrow can bring. I'm a big believer. I read the Jim Collins books years ago, and all the business direction books, they sort of all give you formulas and they all work. You just sort of have to stay to one, right? And his focus was, one of the things was about figure out what you can be the best at. And that's always been our focus. If somebody else is doing it, maybe a private sector group is doing it, maybe a state agency, university, whatever, we probably shouldn't be there. We need to bring something unique. So that became, we sort of reinvested in that and said, what is our singular role that we at the league are able to focus on over the next, several years to get the outcomes that we want to do. And sometimes that means leaving a few programs behind. It might mean doubling down on others, and it certainly means reinventing something completely new.
How is your board responding to the introduction of this next level of activity for the league?
Yeah, board's been great. Our board has consisted of officials from across the state of Michigan, big cities and small cities. The mayor of Grand Rapids is our chair, and we're down to some really small small little villages that we have in there, Three Oaks and a few others that have been on the board. So they're great. I think, again, they've been involved and I think are giving of their time and their energy in the organization because they've seen that innovation. They've seen that change. So the fact that we're coming back again and saying, despite a lot of these successes, we're going to take it in a slightly different direction is not strange, I think, in their eyes.
Sounds to me like they're encouraged by
it. They're encouraged by it. A few are even encouraging us, what's next? What's next? What's next? So that's become kind of our MO with our board. And so to walk in and say, hey, we're going to go climb another mountain is not completely off kilter for them. And they've been just nothing but supportive.
You're not going to be asking staff or board to be doing the same things 2 times faster.
Right.
You actually have an expectation that you're going to be doing some things very, very differently.
Well, one of the things we decided upon when we looked at our ultimate goals in terms of policy changes, we've got to increase our own presence, and we have to partner more with organizations that don't typically, and individuals and businesses and everybody else that don't typically run in our lane. And working out of Lansing, we're headquartered in Ann Arbor, but we have a strong presence in Lansing. When you get into state government issues, everyone has a tendency to just focus on their own lane. But we look around at some of the lanes that we like to see a little bit doing different things, and they're not doing them. For years, it's been sort of a bit of frustration watching that others weren't moving on some of the things we thought to be important. So that's where we're going to jump in and be a lot more aggressive in other lanes. That is a fundamental change in terms of the Lansing mindset. And so getting involved with other people, other organizations, and is really, really important for what we do.
So you've really looked at the work that needs to be done and said, with the resources that are necessary here, we've got to find partners in this project that have a similar vision. Might not be in our association world, but certainly need to be a part of this next version 2.0.
And again, our natural lane is local government. That's where we've been around since 1898. And I like to say for 100 years, we probably did many of the same things. I think in the last decade and certainly moving forward, I don't have a Rolodex anymore, but if I pretended I did, I like to say that my Rolodex probably looks completely different in terms of the types of people who are in it as opposed to, what it looked like for the executive director in 1950 or 1970 or 1980 or whatever it was. So you're right, getting out there and meeting with vast groups of people that don't immediately look like they belong together, but who ultimately bring something to the table is important. We're talking about creating great communities. Developers want to develop projects in downtown. And, universities are all in communities around the state. And that's such an important thing about attracting and retaining talent. And
private
industries crying they can't get the great people for jobs. And so people we know are following where they want to live. It has very little to do with some of the old measurements that the state uses to look at business in terms of taxation and those types of things. It's, do I want to live there? And if you're in Midland and Dow Chemical is out trying to get the top end engineering and chemist students from all over the country and they don't want to live in Midland, that's a problem for everybody up there. Mm-hmm. And we've got to figure out a way to build on what Midland has and what its assets are in order to construct the best place possible. And you can extrapolate that all the way up to Detroit in a huge community like that, or all the way down to the smallest towns. And so maybe that's a chamber of commerce. Maybe it's a private business. Maybe it's a nonprofit. It certainly is the local government and the civic leaders. All these different people that think they belong in different camps really have the same goal. And our goal now is to sort of play in that space and get more people engaged and working towards making these policy changes in the state that ultimately allow us to have the greatest places possible.
Dan, how do we teach leaders to expand their Rolodex?
I might say something that's probably not an answer you'd expect, but I think I always tell the staff here, if we do the things we're supposed to do, the old school stuff, really well, then we can do other stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, you sort of can't just drop everything and say, I'm going to be a crazy uncle now and start going off in different directions. In our case, we have lobbying services and educational services, and we have insurance services and all the typical stuff that a large association like ours would have.
And a very high membership support rate.
Yes. If you're a startup, I guess you can just start in the crazy uncle position. But for those of us that are coming into association leaderships, even business leadership roles, you got to do that stuff well first to get anybody who might be a naysayer or somebody who can't think differently on board. If you're doing that stuff great, and then you walk in the door one day and say, hey, how about we try this? The answer is going to be yes, more often than not. I get a lot of my juice, my internal juice from seeing a lot of the stuff going on in places like Detroit, where, a neighborhood that was left for dead 10, 15 years ago, a few entrepreneurial thinking people moved in, or a business came in, or a social entrepreneur showed up on the scene, and now there's great things happening.
Isn't that cool? It's kind of like a forest fire. It goes through, and at first it's nothing but devastation, and all of a sudden you go back a few years later, and all the new seedlings that are coming through, and 5 years later, all the new trees you can recognize.
Absolutely.
So it becomes a whole new ecosystem.
Absolutely. I mean, and you see that, and now let's face it, Michigan, we've been through tough few decades. A lot of what we saw as Michigan's 1.0, which was sort of the industrial revolution of the 20th century. Now we're sort of moving into Michigan's 2.0. That has more to do with place and has more to do with our resources.
That kind of aligns really well with
absolutely,
you, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing we've done here that maybe is a lesson is we've aligned our mission with something larger than what our members have. It's not just the bottom line at City Hall, or it's not just how does this affect the local inspector's ability to perform his or her job. It's how do we make Michigan better? And you can get more people keyed into that than you can for anything else. So
but it makes sense for people too, because if they're aligning with what you're doing and they can see the natural alignment to the bigger picture, boom.
Absolutely.
They're in.
Absolutely. And that's where I say, you got town-gown relationships with universities. And, we're doing this here in Lansing today. And what happens in the capital region, Michigan State and Lansing Community College. And even now you've got Central and Western, everybody else downtown doing graduate programs and things. That's vitally important. And they're going to have as big a say in what happens in this region than the city government or the county government or anybody else. So they've got different goals on their sheets, in terms of what they're doing, what they're trying to do from a student perspective, from a faculty perspective. But ultimately, this is a great place. If this is a great place, an even better place with more opportunity, they're going to do better, as is the local developer, as is the merchant or anybody else around here. So, you've got to figure out a way to go over and get them and not just leave them in sort of the university lane, if you will, but go get them and pull them into maybe a larger lane that has us working on, a better East Lansing.
So you become kind of the catalyst not only to make things happen, but you also becomes kind of the glue that can find new ways to bind things together that might not naturally go together, but do when you take into account the bigger picture.
Yeah, begrudgingly.
There's not a lot of people that have that talent, if that's why you're begrudging it.
Well, right. I mean, you're sort of waiting on different folks to do things and leading horses to water and all those types of things. And the horse still doesn't drink, or we're still not moving on some things because people aren't comfortable getting outside their lanes. We've just decided, and there are others doing this too. There are some great partners we have in the state and other people in different arenas doing really cool stuff. But we've decided, okay, we can perform that function. Back to what we can do well. Yep. We can do that well. And, if we leave our baggage at the door, in terms of what other folks might think about cities or whatever, and just say, okay, the goal here is to create a great place, we're confident that what we come up with as a group, of 10 or 12 or 15 or 100 or 200 groups is going to be, 90% of what we come up with on our own. It's probably going to be better in the end too. So we can do that. That's something we can do. And I think waiting around for others to do it or do it in their own world hasn't worked out so well. So we're going to jump in with both feet.
Bonifer, we could talk for hours about this one.
Dan's interview was so inspiring. I was riveted the entire time. Some of the things that he talked about and how he views their future inspired me to start thinking more about where I am in the process and how I want to take my organization forward.
So before we started this conversation, we talked about some of the work that Dan had done at the league. So Bonifer, you made a very clear statement to me that I'd like for you to repeat regarding what you have to do in order to get to the point that the Michigan Municipal League and Dan is at right now. Can you repeat that phrase?
I think Dan said it best. He talked about doing the old school stuff really well so that you can go do new stuff.
So I think there's a huge lesson there to be learned from any executive or any leader, and that is the opportunity to take on what's next is somewhat dependent on making sure where you have been is locked down solid.
Right. Right.
And what you are saying, Bonifer, not only in listening to the interview, but in practice, because you are also aware of the league's work, in the work that you do, is that the league has their work locked down.
Absolutely. Anyone that you mentioned, Michigan Municipal League 2, their brand is so well established, and there's such integrity and such trust in what comes out of MML. There's no hesitation with what they introduce next because they have that foundation behind them.
Why is it so important, Bonifer, that we not just lock down where we've been, but we make sure on a regular basis we're implementing some of these new things that Dan was talking about?
I think it's critical as we try and navigate this new world that we live in to stay true to our core mission, no matter whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, which I think Dan has done for MML quite well.
Right.
But it's also learning to adapt. We heard from Summer about sort of embracing chaos.
Yep.
And we hear from Dan this idea that once you get your homework done, you have that core really handled, you can go do new and innovative things. You have to do your homework first. So as you're moving through the pure reinvention steps, the disruption creates a lot of that chaos. The owning is really your opportunity to get your homework done, really to, as Dan said, get the old school stuff done really well. And he's finally at this place where he can simplify. It seems simple to us now that we're hearing it. But there's been a lot of work going into where they are today.
And let's just talk for a minute about the simplify, because I think you're right. There is Dan as the executive is at a spot where he can simplify this next phase.
Right.
How does the business then respond to the very simple message that comes from the executive, but tends to magnify when it goes into the business?
Mm-hmm. I think actually one of the ways that Dan answers that, I don't remember if he addresses it in the interview, but their restructuring is sort of embodying getting the organization internally ready to implement all of these changes. And that sends a clear message to the staff that there's a different support mechanism, that we're living differently. I also think from what Summer has said, there is active encouragement internally to continue to do those old school stuff well, that's just as important as any of the new stuff. So I think although it feels chaotic, maybe the deeper into the organization you go, I think Dan and Summer and some of his other executive team leaders probably work pretty purposefully in communicating to their team to keep them inspired and on the goal, focused on the goal.
Well, I think it is very purposeful and very intentional that there is a messaging today that is starting to build on this next foundation. Right? Currently do the things we're doing well, but start preparing for the what's next. So how, as a leader, Bonifer, do we eliminate some of that uncertainty?
I don't know that we can eliminate it, but I think we can model how to handle the uncertainty. And I think Summer's story speaks to her ability to handle the uncertainty and perhaps her ability to model for her staff how to handle the chaos and the uncertainty. And I think Dan is also in that place. I think it's important that as you get deeper into the organization, that folks can look to their leadership for how to handle things that are ambiguous. As you said, we're creatures of habit. We all move to the place of comfort. It's just a natural response.
Right.
But at the same time, I think we all get a little surge of energy from something new and surprising. And perhaps that's what's going to help the staff carry through, is seeing both the model of how to handle chaos and the energy of something new.
I think the interesting thing for me to be part of and listen and watch in this process is from the bottom up, right, from the organization up, there's an interest in clarity. So there's an interest in trying to remove the unsure to the sure, right, by creating some sort of clarity. So that's a great desire for people to help me understand or clarify for me what added role I play or what new and different things you're expecting from me. But secondly, I watch your own communication as a way to help me understand what that new expectation is. And it's been amazing to me to watch that the communication that people are in tune to is not verbal.
Right.
It is not verbal. It is those behaviors, those decisions, those messages that we send that are nonverbal. And people will say, well, what does that mean? You mean like written? And it's like, no, it's the behavioral nuances that people pick up on when we're comfortable, our body language, our facial expressions. I mean, you can probably go on and on even better than I, Bonifer, on all the different ways people pick up the message when it's nonverbal or non-written. Remember, if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.